The fig is the strangest thing. It hangs fat and dark from a vine that has no business growing underground, its roots threading through cracked limestone like fingers reaching for something they found long ago. Elias holds it to the pale shaft of light falling from above and bites in. Sweet, cold, alive. He laughs out loud, alone in the dark. 3 weeks earlier, a man in Juniper Hollow told Elias the stone cottage on the ridge was worthless. Too old, too far gone, not worth the trouble of a single nail. Most men would have believed him. Elias Boone was not most men, but he was tired enough that he almost did. What a man decides is worthless often turns out to be the very thing that saves him. He just has to get low enough to look. The road into Juniper Hollow was the color of old bone, pale and dry even in late October, and Elias Boone rode it with everything he owned tied to the back of a mule named Copperhead. He was 27 years old and had spent the last 9 of those years doing work that wore a man down from the outside in, trailing cattle through dust and heat, sleeping on frozen ground in the panhandle, riding fence lines for outfits that folded before spring. He was not bitter about any of it. He was simply finished. The cottage had come to him through a land office clerk in Santa Fe, who owed a favor to a man who owed a favor to Elias, and the deed, when it was handed over, was so old the ink had faded to the color of weak tea. The property was described as a stone dwelling on a rocky prominence above a hollow, with no tillable acreage worth mentioning, and a view of nothing in particular. The clerk had been apologetic. Elias had been grateful. He found the place in the late afternoon. It sat at the end of a switchback trail above a dry creek bed, a low square building with walls 18 inches thick and a roof that had partially caved in over what must have once been a kitchen. The remaining rooms were sound enough. The fireplace drew clean. The well outside was sweet. He put Copperhead in the lean-to at the back and stood in the main room watching the last of the sun come through the empty window frame. And for the first time in years, something in his chest went quiet. The nearest neighbor was a widow named Vera Calloway, who ran a small goat operation 1.5 miles down the hollow. She appeared the following morning with a cloth-covered basket and a direct manner of speaking that suggested she had no patience for unnecessary words. She handed him the basket, cornbread, dried apricots, a small jar of honey, looked at the cottage walls the way a carpenter looks at a joint, and said, "You got good stone. The rest is just work." Then she left. Elias ate the cornbread standing in the doorway. It was the best thing he had tasted in months. He began with the kitchen. The collapsed section of roof came down in stages over 3 days. The old vigas rotted through, but the walls holding fine. He cleared the rubble, stacked the usable timber, and began leveling the floor, a mix of packed earth and flat stones that had heaved and cracked over the years into something closer to a dry riverbed than a floor. On the 4th morning, pulling up a large heaved stone near the back wall, his pry bar dropped through empty air beneath it. He stopped, knelt, put his hand into the gap, and felt cool air rising from below, steady and faint, like breath from a sleeping thing. He pulled 2 more stones free and found himself looking down into darkness, a narrow passage, stone cut, leading somewhere the light had not reached in a very long time. He did not go in that day. He covered the opening with a plank, went outside, and split firewood for 2 hours until his arms ached. This was something he had learned about himself. When a thing unsettled him, physical work helped him think it through without making a fool of himself. It could be anything. A root cellar dug by whoever had built the place. A Spaniard, probably, given the age of the stonework. A natural void in the limestone, which was common enough in this part of New Mexico. Something less welcome. A cistern gone bad. A collapsed mine shaft. A den that something four-legged had been using for longer than he had been alive. The air coming up from it had not smelled bad. That mattered. Bad air in an underground space had a character to it. Damp rot, mineral sharpness, the close sweetness of something decomposing. What he had felt coming up through the gap was cool and clean, and faintly, he kept turning the word over. Faintly green. As if something living was exhaling down there. He went to see Vera Calloway that afternoon, not to ask her about it directly, but because she had lived in the hollow long enough to know things about the land that didn't make it into any deed. He found her mending a fence post and helped her finish the job before either of them said anything of consequence. "The cottage," he said eventually. "You know who built it?" She drove a nail with 2 clean strokes. A man named Rogelio Salazar, before the territory changed hands, maybe 1830, 1835. He was a botanist of some kind, studied plants, lived up there alone for years. She paused. People said he did things with the land that didn't make sense for the land, grew things that had no business growing at that elevation. She gave him a sideways look. People also said a lot of things that weren't true. Elias nodded and said nothing more about it. That evening, he sat by the opening for a long time, listening to the cool air move upward in the dark. A botanist, a man who grew things that had no business growing. He had come here to find something worth keeping. It seemed the question was only whether he was willing to go looking. He went in the next morning. He lowered a lantern first, watching the flame for any sign of bad air. It burned steady and clean. Then he went down himself, feet finding carved stone steps, one hand on the wall, the passage narrowing and then opening in a way that reminded him of a held breath released. The lantern light reached ahead of him and caught something green. He stopped on the last step with the cool air moving around him and the silence pressing in from all sides. And he understood before he could fully see it that whatever Rogelio Salazar had built down here, it had been going on without anyone's permission for a very long time. Vera Calloway came up the following afternoon with a question about a fence line that touched the boundary of his property. She found him sitting outside the kitchen with the expression of a man who had recently been handed something he didn't know how to carry. She sat down on the low stone wall without being invited and waited. "You might want to see something," he said finally. She looked at him with the calm of a woman who had lived alone long enough to know that unusual things happened to people who paid attention. "All right," she said. The cavern was roughly 40 feet long and perhaps 20 wide, with a ceiling that rose at the center to a height of 12 or 13 feet. It was not a natural void, but a shaped one. The walls had been smoothed, and in places carved with narrow channels that directed water in thin sheets down to a central depression in the floor, where it collected and drained away through a crack too small for a hand. The ceiling was limestone and showed 3 long fractures running east to west, and through these fractures, thin blades of light fell at angles that shifted with the hour. In the morning, Elias had found the eastern fracture lit the back wall like a low winter sun. By midday, all 3 were open, and the space below was bright enough to read by. What Rogelio Salazar had done, and it was plainly deliberate, plainly the work of a man who understood both plants and stone, was direct, a spring. The water came in through the north wall at about knee height, through a carved notch no wider than a man's fist, ran in a carved channel along the base of the wall, branched at 2 points, and circulated through the growing beds before collecting in the central drain. The beds themselves were stone-edged, filled with dark soil that was still moist and dark and alive despite 40 or 50 years of complete neglect. And things were growing in them. Not everything. Many of the beds held only the dry remains of plants long dead, or bare soil gone to a fine, pale dust. But in the beds nearest the water channels and below the ceiling fractures, plants had persisted, and in some cases flourished in ways Elias could not entirely account for. There were herbs he recognized, a large sage gone woody and sprawling, a mat of something that smelled like thyme when he brushed it, a rosemary bush taller than his knee. There were plants he did not recognize at all, low and dark-leafed, and growing in tight rosettes. And there were the vines. 2 grapevines had come up from somewhere near the base of the south wall, probably from rootstock old enough that the original planting was a question for a historian rather than a farmer. They had sent long arms up the wall and across the ceiling and in places back down again, the tendrils finding every crack, and in the growing beds below the vines, figs in various stages had fallen and composted and seeded and fruited again in a slow cycle that had apparently been going on for decades. The tree, if a thing so old and so spread could be called a tree, was less a single plant than a colony, and it was covered with fruit. Vera stood in the center of the cavern for a long time without speaking. She turned slowly, taking it in. She looked at the water channel, then at the ceiling fractures, then at the largest grapevine, then at him. "He built this," she said. It was not a question. Salazar had to be. She crouched beside the rosemary and pinched a small piece between her fingers and held it to her nose. "This is old, 20 years at least, maybe more." She stood. "The water doesn't stop?" "Hasn't yet. Runs the same at midnight as at noon, as best I can tell." She walked the perimeter of the space, slowly, stopping at each carved channel junction, examining the stonework with the attention she had given his cottage walls on the first morning. When she completed the circuit, she stood beside him again and looked up at the lines of light crossing the ceiling. "He understood what he had," she said quietly. "He designed it so nothing would need him after a point. The water does the work, the light does the work. He just gave it the right shape." Elias had been thinking the same thing since the morning before. A man who built things to last beyond himself. He looked at the old vines on the ceiling, the slow, improbable abundance they had made in the dark, and felt something in him that he did not have a name for yet. Over the following 2 weeks, they worked on the cavern the way people work on something they are not entirely sure belongs to them. Carefully, with a kind of reverence that made them both slower than they might otherwise have been. Elias cleared the dead beds first, removing the dry matter and loosening the soil, and checking the water channels for any blockage. 2 of the channel branches had silted partly closed, and opening them again released a quiet increase in the sound of moving water that made the whole cavern feel more alive. He extended one channel slightly to reach a dry bed near the eastern wall that had good light in the mornings, and packed it with the composted matter he had cleared from the others. Within 4 days, small green points were visible in the dark soil, volunteers from seeds that had been waiting in the mix. Vera came most afternoons. She brought things: dried bean seeds saved from her own garden, a small clay pot of mint rootstock she divided with a knife, 3 seedlings of a chile plant she had been growing inside her house through the winter. She knew plants with the particular knowledge of a person who had grown them out of necessity rather than curiosity, which was different from Salazar's apparent knowledge and complementary to it. Where he had shaped the system, she understood the individual plants within it, what they wanted when they were struggling, what the color of a leaf indicated. "This one needs more air," she said of a struggling rosette near the north wall. "It's too wet. Turn the channel there 2 inches to the right." She gestured without looking up from the plant. He did. She was correct. They did not discuss what they were doing in terms of ownership or plans. The question of what the cavern was for hovered between them pleasantly, unanswered. It was enough, for now, that it was being tended. One afternoon, Elias brought a small table down and a jar for water, and spent the better part of a day sketching the layout of the cavern: the beds, the channels, the ceiling fractures, and the angles of light they cast at different hours, the location of the spring inlet. He was not a trained draftsman, but he had always been able to see how things fit together in space, and the drawing came out clean and legible. When Vera saw it, she studied it for a while, and then pointed to an empty area along the west wall. Squash would do there. That light in the afternoons is long and low. It would warm the soil. She paused. Or gourds, something that wants to climb. She pointed upward at a section of ceiling the vines hadn't reached. "There's room." He added a note to the drawing. In the evenings, he worked on the cottage above, reframing the kitchen roof, laying new flagstone for the floor, fitting the window with a proper shutter against the cold that was coming down off the mountains. He realized, building 2 things at once: a life above ground and something under it. The cottage was practical shelter. The cavern was harder to name: a garden, a legacy, a gift from a dead man who had understood that the best things were the ones that kept going. One night, he sat at his small table in the main room with a cup of coffee and the drawing of the cavern in front of him, and thought about what kind of life was possible here. Not grand, not the kind that men talked about in town with their talk of acreage and head of cattle and what a man was worth. Something quieter and stranger and, the word came to him slowly, permanent. Something that belonged to the land rather than merely sitting on it. He looked at the drawing for a long time. Then he rolled it carefully and set it on the shelf above the fireplace, next to the old deed with its faded ink, and went to bed with the sound of the wind off the mesa, and, below it, the small sound of water moving through stone. He was splitting wood at first light when the man came up the trail, broad-shouldered, well-dressed for the territory, riding a horse that cost more than Elias's cottage and everything in it. He introduced himself as a land agent out of Santa Fe and said he represented a party interested in acquiring the ridge property for mineral survey purposes. He looked at the cottage with polite dismissal. He looked at the lean-to and copperhead and the modest pile of firewood. He said the offer was fair and that, given the nature of the land, Elias would not receive a better one. Elias set down his axe. He said he would think about it. The man left a card and rode back down the trail. He told Vera that afternoon. She was quiet for a moment and then asked what the offer was. He told her. She was quiet again. "That's not a fair offer," she said. "That's the offer a man makes when he believes you don't know what you have." "Maybe I don't know what I have." "You know exactly what you have." She looked at him steadily. "The question is whether you're going to let someone tell you otherwise." Elias had heard the word mineral and thought, as anyone would, of silver. There had been silver pulled out of the hills south of Juniper Hollow 20 years back. Played out now, but the survey parties still came through from time to time. A land agent would not ride personally to a ridge property over a modest silver prospect. He would send a clerk. He went to the land office in the nearest town, a half-day's ride, and spent an afternoon reading through survey records and transfer documents until a deputy clerk grew visibly uncomfortable with the depth of his interest and offered, perhaps to conclude the visit, that the ridge property had been flagged in a preliminary survey the previous spring in connection with a water rights assessment. Water rights. He rode home slowly, turning it over. The spring in the cavern fed the carved channels that fed the garden. A closed system, nearly. But water that came in had to come from somewhere. And water that drained away went somewhere. And in a territory where water determined the value of land more than any mineral, a consistent underground spring was not a small thing. He sat at his table that evening with a candle and thought it through with the methodical care he had once applied to reading terrain on a cattle drive, looking at what was visible, inferring what was not, following the logic of the land where it led. The spring came from the north wall. The hollow below the ridge had a dry creek bed that ran with water in spring and early summer and went dry by July. A reliable subsurface flow that fed both the creek bed and the cavern was worth considerably more to a party interested in water rights than a land agent's first offer would suggest. He was not angry about the low offer. He understood it as a tactic, and he had no quarrel with tactics. What he did not intend was to be a man who sold something of value because he had been made to feel it was worthless. He wrote a short letter to the land agent saying he had decided to decline and would not be reconsidering. He gave it to the postal rider the following morning. 4 days later, a second man came up the trail. This one was less well-dressed but more direct, and he did not pretend the offer was generous. He said his employer had a significant interest in the water survey results, and that the current offer represented a reasonable premium over what the property would otherwise command, and that if Elias was under the impression the land was worth considerably more, he was mistaken. Elias offered the man a cup of coffee, which he accepted. They sat on the low stone wall outside the kitchen in the afternoon sun, and Elias asked him, pleasantly, what specifically the water survey had found. The man, perhaps warmed by the coffee and the sun and the absence of hostility, said more than he likely intended to before catching himself. He finished his coffee. He said the offer stood for 30 days. He went back down the trail. Elias sat in the sun for a while longer, thinking. He consulted Vera because she had lived in the territory long enough to know how these things worked, how land passed hands, how water rights were registered, how a man protected what was his from parties with more resources and more experience at acquisition than he possessed. She listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she said, "There's a man in Las Cruces. He handles land disputes and knows water law better than anyone in the Southern Territory. His name is Agustin Reyes. He helped me when a rancher tried to claim my spring 2 years ago." She paused. "He's not cheap." "What's the cavern worth to you?" Elias asked. She looked at him with the expression she used when she felt a question was doing more work than it appeared to be doing. "To me? You've put work into it, plants, time. It's your land. The plants aren't mine. The water isn't mine. Salazar built it, and it built itself for 50 years before either of us came along." He kept his eyes on the distance. "I'm not inclined to treat it as a private possession, but I need to know what it is before I can decide how to hold it." Vera was quiet for a long time. A goat made a sound in the pen below them, and then was quiet again. "The water," she said finally, "feeds my creek in the dry months. I've known it for years, but didn't know where it came from. I just knew it never fully went dry." She paused. "If someone owns the source and redirects it, my operation fails. The hollow dries up." She looked at him directly. "So yes, it matters to me." They rode to Las Cruces together 4 days later. Agustin Reyes was a careful, unhurried man who read documents the way a good doctor read a patient, not for what they said, but for what they implied. He reviewed the deed, the survey flag notation Elias had copied from the land office records, and the preliminary description of the spring system. And he spent a long time looking at Elias's drawing of the cavern, the channels, the inlet, the drain. "The spring is on your property," he said at last. "The water rights, under territorial law, attach to the surface deed if the source is on your land and you are a documented beneficial user." He tapped the drawing. "Are you using this water?" "For a garden," Elias said, "and likely for the kitchen above." "Then you are a beneficial user." He set down the drawing. "Register it, formally, before anyone else files a competing claim." He looked at Vera. "You should also document your downstream use. It establishes the pattern of flow and strengthens his registration." The registration cost Elias nearly everything he had set aside for the winter, which was not a comfortable fact. Reyes filed the paperwork before they left Las Cruces. He said any move against the property now would take years and significant legal expenditure to challenge successfully, and that well-funded parties looking for easy acquisitions tended to move to easier targets. Riding back through the late afternoon with the sun behind them and the mountains going purple ahead, Vera said, "You spent your winter money." "I did. I have enough put by for 2. She said it without looking at him, in the same flat tone she used to describe what a goat needed, or what weather was coming. Elias rode for a while without answering. The road was the color of old bone in the fading light. "That's a generous offer," he said. "It's a practical one," she said. The letter from the land agent's firm arrived 10 days later. It did not withdraw the offer. It stated instead that a formal inquiry had been filed contesting the validity of the original deed, citing irregularities in the chain of title that predated Elias's acquisition. Agustin Reyes, when Elias rode to him with the letter, read it twice and set it down with the careful expression of a man recalibrating. "This is not a water dispute," he said. "This is an attempt to void the deed entirely. If they succeed, the water registration becomes moot." He looked at Elias. "You need the original title chain. All of it. Back to Salazar." He sat in the cavern that night with the lantern turned low, listening to the water move through the channels in the dark. The fig tree made no sound. The vines made no sound. The spring came in through its notch in the north wall with the same indifference it had maintained for 50 years. He had come here to be done with things that wore him out. He had found something worth more than he had imagined possible, and now it required more of him. More money, more effort, more persistence than he had reserved. The land agent's firm had resources and time and legal machinery. He had a drawing on a shelf and a winter food supply he had already spent, and a woman down the hollow who had offered to help him in a way he hadn't yet allowed himself to think about clearly. He thought about Rogelio Salazar, who had built this place and then was gone, and whether Salazar had known it might be contested one day and had built it anyway. You built things to last, and then the lasting was someone else's problem. Maybe that was what it meant to make something real. Not that it would be safe, but that it would be worth the trouble of defending. He picked up a fig from the ground and turned it in the lantern light. Sweet, cold, alive. He was not done. He went to Vera in the morning, not with a question this time, and not with a problem, with a proposal. He had thought it through in the night, and it was simple enough that he did not need much time to say it. He proposed that they register the property jointly, that she bring her documented history with the hollow and the downstream water use, and that whatever the cavern became, garden, supply, seed store, whatever use could be made of a place that grew things year-round in New Mexico territory. They built it together. She said yes before he finished. Agustin Reyes was not a man given to optimism, but when Vera Calloway sat across from him and laid out 40 years of continuous use and residence in the hollow, recorded in 2 different county ledgers, in letters, in a water agreement with a neighboring property dated 1861. His careful expression shifted towards something warmer. "This establishes pattern and precedent," he said. "Her tenure contextualizes the property's use history and materially complicates any attempt to void the title on the grounds of abandonment or discontinuous claim." He looked between them. "Combined with the registration, this is a defensible position. A strong one." The deed challenge came before a land examiner in Santa Fe 6 weeks later. Elias had spent the intervening time gathering every piece of documentation that touched the Salazar property. Survey plats, tax records, a reference in a territorial naturalist's published journal from 1848 to a remarkable subsurface garden maintained by R. Salazar near the Hollow Road in Doña Ana County. That last item had been found by Reyes's clerk in a university archive in Albuquerque, and when Elias read it, he had to sit down for a moment in Reyes's office because it meant the cavern had been documented, put into print, while Salazar was still alive, and the description matched the carved channels and the spring and the figs precisely enough to settle any question about what had been built there and by whom. The land examiner was a methodical woman named Senora Bustamante, who read every document submitted and asked questions in a tone that gave no indication of her inclinations. She asked Elias how long the spring had been in continuous operation. He said he could not speak to before his arrival, but could document it since. She asked Vera how long she had relied on the downstream flow. Vera gave her the dates and the ledger entries. Bustamante asked whether the cavern had been altered in ways inconsistent with the original construction. Elias described everything he had done, the cleared beds, the partial rechanneling, the new flagstone floor above, and Reyes produced the drawing from the shelf, which by then had become an official exhibit. The examiner studied the drawing for a long time. She asked whose work it was. Elias said his. She asked if it was accurate. He said to the best of his ability. She ruled 3 weeks later. The original deed was valid. The chain of title, while irregular by territorial standards of documentation, was unbroken. The water rights registration stood. The deed challenge was dismissed. Reyes sent the ruling by mail, and Elias read it at his kitchen table in the new flagstone room with the shutter open and the November air coming in off the mesa. He read it twice. Then he walked down the passage and stood in the cavern for a while, in the midday light, watching the 3 ceiling fractures lay their long, bright lines across the vines. The winter passed well. Vera's garden stores and his supplemented each other, and the cavern's yield. Herbs through the cold months, the last figs before the hard freeze found them. A small harvest of things Elias still didn't have complete names for, added a margin of comfort that neither of them would have had alone. He finished the cottage roof. He added a proper door to the passage entrance, set flush with the kitchen floor, with a latch that could be worked from either side. In the spring, he built a second water channel along the east wall, and Vera planted the squash she had suggested in the autumn, training it up a simple frame of stripped willow branches. The gourds came in June and were so abundant that she carried a basketful to the nearest town and traded them for seed stock she had been wanting for 2 years. The man she traded with asked where the gourds had come from, and she said her garden and did not elaborate. One evening in April, they were sitting at the small table in the cavern. Elias had added a second chair, eating a simple supper of bread and roasted herbs and early figs, and the afternoon light was coming through the east fracture at the long, low angle that lit the whole far wall in gold. Vera said, Salazar must have sat here like this, in this same light. Probably alone, Elias said. Maybe not always. They were quiet for a moment. Outside, above them through a foot of stone, the mesa was going into evening. Below, the water moved through its channels with the unhurried patience of a thing that had been doing its work long before they arrived and would go on doing it long after. I've been thinking, Vera said, about the open beds along the north wall. Something from Chile, a winter green, very cold hardy. I have seeds that I've been keeping for a time when I had the right conditions. This would be the right conditions. I think so. She looked at the bed in question with the appraising look she brought to all growing things. Early fall planting. They'd be established before the cold. Then we'll do it in the fall, he said. She nodded and tore a piece of bread. The lantern on the table between them burned with a small, steady flame. The fig vine on the ceiling held its fruit in the dimness above. The spring came in through the north wall and went on its way through the channels, doing exactly what it had been shaped to do by a careful man 50 years ago, feeding things, keeping things alive, making a place in the dark where ordinary life could become, with enough patience, something astonishing. By midsummer, Vera's goats had developed a habit of drifting up the switchback trail on their own in the evenings, and standing outside the kitchen door, as if they knew something was better up here than down below. Elias began to think they were right. The cottage was finished now, solid and squared, and smelling of cut timber and wood smoke. The cavern below it breathed its cool green air. One morning he found Vera already down in the garden before he was, kneeling in the east bed in the early light with soil on her hands and a look on her face that he recognized because it was the same one he wore every time he came down the steps, pure, uncomplicated gladness.